In the part 1 of our breakdown of the Kursk offensive, we covered how exactly Ukrainians have managed to break through 2 Russian defensive lines and take a foothold on around 1000 square kilometers of Kursk region. Despite these successes, Ukrainians lacked forces to take a rapidly reinforced by Russians Korenevo, a sizable chunk of territory to the south of same river, despite being cut off by Ukrainian airstrikes on bridges, is also held by Russians after Marines arrived there. These two factors make the Ukrainian western flank quite weak, as most of the positions are anchored on small villages that are constantly bombed by Russian aviation and artillery. In August, while Russians were still disorganized and shocked by offensive, this was not a major issue. However, at this point, Russian grouping of forces north received significant reinforcements from other parts of the front line and are ready to begin the counterattacks with the goal of ejecting Ukrainians from their territory. It's also important to mention that the Russian command here is pressured by the Kremlin to do it as soon as possible and regardless of losses, as will be evident from events we will cover in this chapter. Coming back to the battlefield, on September 9th, Russians gather a long column of vehicles, mostly tanks and BMDs of the 51st Air Assault Regiment of newly arrived 106th Air Assault Division. The column cuts through Ukrainian positions and quite surprisingly reaches Snagost and then disperses right behind Ukrainian lines. While on march, Russian forces met minimal resistance, likely due to a combination of factors like proper jamming and well-executed reconnaissance, as well as lack of Ukrainian forces in the area. The auxiliary assaults by the forces of 155th Marine Brigade also likely helped to distract Ukrainian forces of the 103rd TDF Brigade and expose their flank. By some accounts, Russian Marines here, similar to other forces deployed to Kursk, are also reinforced by former servicemen of Wagner Group, which used to form PMC's professional corps. By September 11th, it becomes clear that the raid swept Ukrainians from a number of villages south of Korenevo and reopened the land corridor to Glushkovo, as Russians sent more reinforcements into created wedge near Snagost. Together with that, the paratroopers start assaults on Lyubimovka. This attack is yet another evidence that the western flank of the salient, without control over Korenevo, is one of the few weak spots Ukrainians have, but they can do little to change that at this point. Russians also understand that, beginning a rapid build-up of forces, with the final goal to concentrate most of their VDV and Marines here to replicate the success near Snagost on larger scale. Ukrainians answer with their own flank attack, striking in the area of Vesoloe and Menvezhye. This operation is executed mostly by elements of the swiftly redeployed 225th Assault Battalion, with the support from the elements of the newly arrived 21st Mechanized and 95th Air Assault Brigades. The Assault Battalion provides drone support with Horn Group unit, as well as clears border fortifications. After that, fresh forces of the 21st Brigade on Leopard 2s and CV-90s surge forward, facing significant resistance, but a kin of Russians try to disperse behind enemy lines. Without reaching significant territorial gains, the Ukrainian forces still divert attention of the portion of 51st Air Assault Regiment that was storming Lyubimovka, halting the Russian advance there. Paratroopers still enter the village, but are not capable of advancing as fast as few days ago. They also sustain heavy casualties, as the area around Lyubimovka quickly turns into the graveyard of the Russian vehicles. Just from September 11th to 14th, here, Russians lost at least 5 BMDs. It's also important to note that these vehicles are notorious for their lack of armor and easily ignitable ammunition, which explains why almost any hit results in catastrophic detonation. Head-on assaults on BMDs, therefore, show the urgency with which Russians try to push Ukrainians out, as well as highlight the inevitable shift to borderline suicidal assaults, which remain the only tactic Russians employ to achieve territorial gains in absence of obvious cracks in defenses, such as one in Snagost. By September 15th, they also intensify attacks in the eastern part of the salient, taking Borki village with the combined forces of the 810th Marine Brigade, as well as Sarmat and Arbat battalions. Russian drone strikes also become more and more common across the salient, keeping Ukrainian vehicle losses way higher than the Russian ones. Despite that, from September 15th to 25th, no other breakthroughs were achieved as the situation more or less hangs in balance again. Ukrainian commander, likely Syrsky himself, as the author of the operation, faced a dilemma. It's quite obvious that without reinforcements, the weak western flank will soon continue to crumble, since losses mount for both sides but the Russians simply renew them faster despite losing more in countless assaults. The deployment of the fresh 21st Brigade showed that introducing more forces for sure helps to slow down the adversary, but this means weakening other parts of the front line. Syrskyi ultimately decides to continue reinforcing the Kursk area, bringing the elements of the 1st and 17th Tank and 41st Mechanized Brigades into action throughout the first half of October. Ukrainians also continue striking pontoon bridges across the same river, keeping Russian logistics on the western flank under pressure. Since such targets can usually be hit effectively with HIMARS rockets, Ukrainian aviation, armed with high-precision bombs, shifts its focus towards Russian positions in Vysolo. This support allows troops to finally secure a foothold in the village by the end of the month, though the 21st Brigade and auxiliary forces suffer significant losses in scarce Western equipment during the fighting. Without an element of surprise and with little cover, Ukrainian mechanized columns faced swarms of Russian drones that destroyed up to 10 CV-90s and 1 Leopard 2. It's worth noting, however, that unlike assaults involving BMDs, such attacks on these Western vehicles have a significantly higher survival rate for soldiers due to their superior design. This is evident not only from the fact that most of the destroyed vehicles were abandoned by their crews and remained in one piece, but also from the footage showing CV-90s and Leopard 2s, specifically the Swedish Stridsvagn 122 variant, operating after sustaining FPV drone strikes. In one example, this type of Ukrainian tank is seen evacuating a damaged T-72 across the border, while its own turret burns following the Russian strike. To the east, the Ukrainian positions are reinforced by elements of the 101st and 129th CDF brigades, including the elite 253rd Assault Battalion RA. Russians at the same time reinforce the area of Korenevo with the whole 106th Airborne Division, deploying 119th and 137th Airborne Regiments, in addition to already present 51st, on this narrow part of the front line. This is nothing but a preparation for the next wave of attacks, akin to those conducted by the 51st Airborne Regiment, but on larger scale. Backed up by the 234th Air Assault Regiment from the 76th Air Assault Division and 56th Air Assault Regiment from the 7th Air Assault Division, the Korenevo grouping represents one of the largest concentrations of elite VDV forces since the battle for Kyiv. The word elite, however, applies only to a certain portion of it, because for a while, even the best Russian units internally separated into a small portion of valuable and competent specialists, had a much more numerous expendable fraction that is meant for one-way assaults, often but not always referred to as Storm V, though VDV regiments apparently still maintain a slightly larger fraction of elite specialists than other motor rifle or tank units. Since October 1st, Russians begin a new wave of mechanized and infantry assaults on Ukrainian positions around Korenevo. Now, they attack with replenished Marine Brigades, mostly used as expendable troops, and only afterwards try to target weak spots with VDV forces. The attacks are directed not only towards Zeleny Shlyakh, but also from the north, with elements of the 810th Marine Brigade, and in the Vysolo area. For 10 days, Ukrainians successfully repel most of the attacks, but pressure mounts. The Ukrainian command swiftly redeploys the experienced 47th Mechanized Brigade with its M1 Abrams and M2 Bradleys, as well as full 36th Marine Brigade to the salient, but it's too late. On October 10th, the Russians finally locate and punch through a weak spot in the area of Lyubimovka and advance into Novoivanovka. Despite the road from Snagas to Zeleny Shlyakh becoming one of the first so-called roads of death in the Kursk region due to a huge amount of destroyed Russian vehicles littering it, the success is significant. Ukrainians were taken by surprise on many positions, which caused an incident where 9 drone operators were captured by soldiers of the Russian 155th Marine Brigade and executed. Facing prospects of being cut out in narrow corridor that is constantly assaulted from all sides, Ukrainians begin the withdrawal of troops from Korenevo outskirts. This way, by October 13th, Ukrainians retreat from Olgovka and Kremennoe, avoiding the encirclement. Together with that, Russians, who paid for another quick leap forward, with hundreds of men and dozens of pieces of equipment, are forced to slow down. The number of aggressive assaults in the area of Pogrebki from October 10th to 16th, which were meant to cut off the Ukrainian salient towards Korenevo completely, apparently failed due to extremely poor planning. In one video, we can see the BTR-82, likely of the 810th Marine Brigade, that simply drives towards 2 Ukrainian T-64 BVs head-on. The first tank reacts quickly to the threat, and once BTR approaches, makes a shot at point-blank range. The high-explosive shell tears apart the thinly armored hull and launches the turret of the vehicle upwards. A few crew members miraculously survive and surrender. Afterwards, the BTR is shot again, this time with an armor-piercing shell by the second T-64BV, to make sure that it's not going anywhere. To be fair, one of the T-64BVs that repelled the reckless attack of the Russian BTR-82 is later destroyed by an FPV drone, after it was stuck and abandoned by the crew at exactly the same spot. To be double fair, behind the forest, along which two Ukrainian T-64BVs moved, the whole graveyard of tightly packed BTR-82s form, as a result of astonishingly bloody and completely pointless assaults here. One of these was also recorded, featuring how 3 Russian BTRs approached the above-mentioned forest, apparently held by Ukrainian troops, drop off infantry in the open field, and retreat. The troops, apparently under fire, immediately panic and also retreat in complete disarray, taking heavy casualties and demonstrating a practically non-existent level of planning and coordination among Russian seemingly elite Marines. Such attacks by the 810th Marine Brigade are repeated until most of their BTRs are lost near that forest. However, the main focus of the Russian command apparently remains on reaching Malaya Loknia to drive an even deeper wedge in Ukrainian-held territory. At this point, the 155th Marine Brigade finds itself partially encircled from the 3 sides and under drone onslaught, losing dozens of vehicles to push forward. On October 18th, the Russians conduct mechanized assaults along the key road from Novoivanovka to Malaya Loknia, but consistently hit drone-dropped landmines, forming yet another road of death. One of the lucky BTRs that reaches closest to the village is finished off by a Ukrainian tank defending the area. Overall, from October 1st to 20th, in this area, Russians lost over 50 armored vehicles, and apparently hundreds if not thousands of men belonging to 155th Marine Brigade, that is close to being completely annihilated in combat again by combined efforts of the elements of the 36th Marine, 47th Mechanized, 82nd and 95th Air Assault Brigades. This is partially seen as a revenge for multiple war crimes the brigade committed, but much more important is that its role as a ram, which pushed through Ukrainian positions despite unthinkable losses, is almost over. This is not the first instance of heavy losses in the 155th Marine Brigade, as it was already practically destroyed and routed near Kyiv, then Vuhledar, and finally near Novomykhailivka, repeating the same catastrophic mistakes over and over. In conclusion, the recent bloody assaults allowed Russians to reduce the area controlled by Ukraine from 1300 at its peak to approximately 700 square kilometers, by twice exploiting weak spots in defenses that emerged after dozens of very costly and fruitless assaults. To repeat this pattern, Russians obviously need to quickly regenerate an expendable fraction of their forces, and here they find help from abroad. North Korea, which recently became a key Russian supplier of millions of artillery shells and hundreds of ballistic missiles, also sends its troops to help. For the first time, these soldiers are spotted on training grounds on October 18th, using mostly Russian equipment. In total, the plan is to receive 12,000 men from North Korea as reinforcements for their grouping of forces north, which will become the first direct participation of a third country in the conflict since its beginning. The specific forces Kim Jong-un sends are hard to identify, but they are collectively referred to as 11th Corps, which includes at least elements of 92nd and 94th Special Operations Brigades. In reality, however, its second name, the Storm Corps, better reflects its nature of being a unit of mostly assault infantry without much mechanized assets. While Koreans are still going through the training, though, we have to mention that despite recent setbacks, Ukrainians still lose positions mostly on western flank, while attacks happen pretty much everywhere. This is because on the eastern and southeastern parts of the salient, Russians amassed mostly motor rifle units, which are replenished with men and equipment way slower than seemingly elite VDV and Marines, concentrated to the west. On October 20th, Ukrainians also shoot down an Orion medium-altitude attack drone, even though it is the 9th destroyed UAV of this type. Out of a few dozen Russians produced, this incident is significant. Orions, together with Forpost UAVs, were actively used in the Kursk region since the very beginning due to a lack of Ukrainian mid-range air defenses, and were responsible for destroying at least a few dozen Ukrainian pieces of equipment with their own miniature missiles. Called HBPLA, these munitions trace origins to Kornet ATGMs, so they combine high accuracy and penetration. Even though the quantity of drones did not allow Russians to curb the initial breakthrough, medium-altitude attack UAVs still inflict losses higher than the much more numerous Russian helicopters that were mostly busy lobbing unguided rockets and highly inaccurate pitch-up attacks after performing a few high-precision friendly fires we covered earlier. In contrast, Ukrainian aviation shows something that can be without exaggeration called resurrection during the Kursk offensive. While the first F-16s were only arriving in August 2024, Ukrainian old MiG-29s and Su-27s were actively supporting the Ukrainian offensive as never before. The secret lies in adaptation of Western weapons for Soviet airframes, which required years of work but clearly paid off. French hammer bombs, American GBU-39s, and JDAMs all add high-precision strike capability that allows Ukrainian aviation to attack high-value targets with something heavier than HIMARS rockets. As we discussed earlier, this allows Ukrainians not only quite easily collapse bridges used for logistics, but also increase pressure on enemy forward positions. The Russians are also using their OMPK glide bombs in Kursk, but those are significantly less precise, even though they still allow Russian aviation to stay mostly out of range of Ukrainian air defenses. Meanwhile, their own surface-to-air missile systems are being successfully destroyed in large numbers by various Ukrainian drones. Therefore, Ukrainians and Russians reach similar effectiveness in the air, but in two different ways, indicating a significant catch-up Ukraine Air Force made since the last offensive, where this activity was fairly low. Another aspect of the air war over the Kursk region is the use of anti-air interceptor drones, a technology Ukraine has pioneered. We have already covered how this became a new threat to Russian helicopters, but as of October, they also play a significant role in taking down Russian attack drones, primarily Lancets, as well as a variety of fixed-wing reconnaissance drones. Coming back to the ground, by October 21st, Ukrainians launched a counterattack and stabilized the situation around Zelený Shlях, sweeping Russians away from many positions, with well-coordinated assaults executed by elements of the 36th Marine, 47th Mechanized, 82nd and 95th Air Assault Brigades. On the Russian side, the 1434th Akhmat Chechnya Regiment is urgently redeployed here to support the virtually destroyed 155th Marine Brigade. That starts losing positions it captured a few weeks ago by paying enormous price in men and equipment. On October 22nd, Russians also start pushing from the eastern flank, approaching Martinovka with combined forces of 11th and 83rd Air Assault Brigades. At this point, more than half of all Russian VDV units were redeployed to Kursk, which hints that the Ukrainian official goal of diverting Russian forces is undeniably achieved, even though there will be a significant lag between redeployment and slowdown in combat on the other critical parts of the front line, such as Pokrovsk. By the end of the month, Russians again go into replenishment mode and have to accumulate men and equipment for the next leap forward. It's important to mention that combat, especially around Zelený Shlях, does not stop for a day, but during this time is characterized by Russians just using and losing less equipment and troops, gaining virtually no ground. They are once again signifying the terrible state of the notorious 155th Marine Brigade. The positions are reinforced by the 137th Airborne Regiment and 83rd Air Assault Brigade. After this partial redeployment of the 225th Assault Battalion and 95th Air Assault Brigade to the area of Zelený Shlях, the Ukrainian advances near Veselое also halt. Seeing no further chance to cut off this area, Ukrainians make decision to retreat, especially as the 21st Mechanized Brigade suffered heavy losses in men and equipment due to activity of Russian fiber optic FPVs, the timely redeployment of VDV forces, and overall poor operational planning. However, since forces are tired in heavy combat, the elements of the 47th Mechanized Brigade were redeployed here as well to cover the withdrawal. Despite Bradleys and Abrams tanks being actively targeted by drones and ATGMs, they successfully evacuated friendly forces across the border after conducting bold raids on a number of Russian positions and suppressing them with fire. On November 2nd, Russians intensify attacks from the north, with still more or less battle-capable and replenished 810th Marine Brigade. They again probe Ukrainian positions, vastly outnumbering the enemy, and seemingly find the right weak spot. Unable to take Malaya Loknya from the western flank, they decide to strike it from the north, moving along the river, which conveniently splits Ukrainian defenses. On November 7th, Russians launch a new major offensive, now trying to reach Malaya Loknya from the north with swift mechanized assaults. Over a dozen of thin-armored BTR-82s of the 810th Marine Brigade depart from Novoselovka in a large column. The vehicles reach Novaya Sorochina, but there is a caveat. At this point, the Ukrainian drones and landmines already destroyed 11 BTR-82s along the road, completely shattering Russian plans by wiping out the whole attack force. Auxiliary strikes from the west also fail, concluding one of the bloodiest and largest mechanized assaults in a long time. The reasons why this attack failed range from absence of proper reconnaissance to the fact that the area was timely reinforced by the 95th Air Assault Brigade, whose positions were earlier taken as the 17th Tank Brigade. It's also clear that 810th Marine Brigade repeats the fate of 155th, executing borderline suicidal orders of the higher command. Both eastern and western flanks, which Russians also constantly probe, Ukrainians meanwhile reinforced with the 4th and 6th Ukrainian regiments, which were recently created to bridge gap between special operations forces and regular mechanized troops. On the next day, the Russian command again throws forces of the 810th Marine Brigade towards Pogrebki, which causes more losses and even fewer territorial gains than the day before. At the same time, the Russian 83rd Air Assault Brigade begins assaults in the area of Daryino with mixed results. PDV forces suffer heavy losses in BMDs and troops, but using numerical advantage push Ukrainians back. Around Zelený Shlyakh, Russians have no progress and only losses. On November 11th, the 155th Brigade briefly comes back to the front line here, just to repeat the brutal mechanized assaults. What's interesting is that past losses likely forced it to use in head-on assaults combination of BMPs and MTLBs instead of BTR-82s, and the least trained soldiers, causing catastrophic losses again. In quite an ironic incident, Russian Marines even drowned 2 of their BMP-3s with extra armor and flags in the river near Novoivanovka. On November 12th, the attacks are repeated again, but what's interesting is that 155th and 810th Marine Brigades start actively using Akhmat MRAPs instead of BTR-82s that took heavy losses before. Overall, however, columns become smaller and are burned down entirely in the process of attacks by the new Special Operations Drone unit in the area called Faust, as well as Birds of Magyar and UAV companies of local brigades. Combined efforts allow Ukrainians to destroy up to a dozen armored vehicles daily, just on the western flank of the salient according to the footage. One of the assaults is particularly interesting because it happens not far away from the forest, where a Ukrainian tank destroyed a Russian BTR at point-blank range. In one of the videos, the 8th Special Operations Regiment shows how 4 Akhmat MRAPs are taken out one by FPVs. Another interesting detail is that on the same intersection, a month ago, Russians abandoned 2 BTR-82s, and since then they have not evacuated them. This once again shows how drones are capable of basically isolating parts of the battlefield. Eventually, these 2 are destroyed, bringing the Russian vehicle losses on this small intersection to 6 in a single day. However, we picked this assault for a more detailed breakdown also because there is a video of the area from the Russians. It was filmed in February 2025 and shows what the rollers of death created by drones look like. Once again, we can pretty much see all the damaged equipment left in the fields, indicating a lack of any efforts to evacuate it. Moreover, 4 more vehicles were destroyed here as well. This is if we don't count WAZ-452 Lov and civilian cars. Note that this is considered an average Russian assault vehicle graveyard, as roads near Zelený Shlyakh are filled with destroyed equipment even more densely, which we will show later. This footage is the best evidence of the remarkable incompetence of the Russian command, and shows exactly how the Kursk offensive forced them to pull equipment needed everywhere on the front line to defend Russia itself with rather questionable effectiveness. November 13th becomes the last day of something that could be called massive mechanized assaults in this area. The Russian 155th and 810th Marine Brigades effectively destroyed themselves against Ukrainian defenses and drones with no significant territorial gains. Quite numerous VDV units were more careful and sustained significant but not yet catastrophic losses, but most of their assaults were also pointless, effectively taking back only one village. In conclusion, the third Russian offensive wave in the Kursk region ends in complete disaster. From November 7th to 14th, in just 1 week, Russians lost 72 pieces of equipment, according to photographic evidence. This is just on the western flank of the Kursk salient, or roughly 25 kilometers of the front line. For the same area and time span, Ukrainians lost 4. Such Russian vehicle losses were unseen since the Battle of Avdiivka, where mindless assaults of huge columns were mostly happening in the area of villages of Stepova and Krasnohorivka. It was widely accepted that the Russians would no longer waste so much equipment due to looming shortage, but the Kursk offensive forced the Russian command to totally rewrite their plans. It's also worth discussing why. War in Ukraine since the very first day has been a multidimensional conflict with particularly important details extending beyond maps. For example, Ukraine as well as Russia significantly rely on their allies, or at least partners, since the conflict became a multi-year war of attrition. Therefore, maintaining an extended military and financial aid, or undermining the support provided to the opponent, are the things that directly shape the battlefield. With the United States being one of key donors of military equipment for Ukraine, it's plausible that one of the many goals of Kursk offensive was to show to whoever wins presidential elections on November 5, 2024, that Ukraine, while undeniably being on back foot, carries potential to shape the conflict the way it wants, and generally speaking is not a lost cause. Subsequently, the goal of Russia was to convince the next US administration in the opposite. Thus, it makes sense to link the unusually heavy use of armor in assaults, which is harmful strategically but can be beneficial tactically, to the Russian plans to deal with incursion by the time of the elections, or at least by the end of November. Some sources suggest that the first deadlines set up by Kremlin for the military command expired in October, but these are mostly unsupported claims. In any case, the three major waves of Russian attacks in Kursk reduced the area of control by Ukrainians roughly by half, but they are nowhere near the end goal of the completely pushing an adversary behind the border. Moreover, mindlessly throwing poorly protected armor against drones and landmines once again proved to be a recipe for mass casualties. With most of the storage bases more than half empty at this point, destroying hundreds of pieces of Russian equipment, urgently pulled out of reserves inside Russia, is yet another overlooked achievement of the Kursk incursion. Coming back to the battlefield itself, as of November 15th, the Russian efforts to advance on the western flank of the salient, especially near Dar'yino and Zelený Shlях, continue to result in equipment and man losses, but no breakthroughs are achieved. Russian columns usually pile up at some bottlenecks, stopped by landmines and eventually finished off by drones. This happens day after day without much change, which shows the level of disregard of the local Russian command for their own soldiers, comparable to the one demonstrated in battles for Vuhledar. On November 17th, the White House grants permission to use ATACMS ballistic missiles against targets on Russian land. This decision also extends to Franco-British Storm Shadow cruise missiles with American components. As much as this is another positive impact of the Kursk operation that crossed too many Russian red lines at this point, Ukraine has to be careful with the choice of targets, since a big fraction of missiles have already been used and the number of remaining ones remains in low double digits. Around November 18th, the controversial reports about Plekhovo surface, which indicates that the Russians at least increased their activity around the town with unknown results. Most likely, the situation here mimics the one around Novoivanovka, which is for a long time is not fully controlled by Ukrainian troops, but belongs more to the grey zone, since Ukrainians sometimes launch attacks inside the village to clash with adversary. By November 20th, Ukrainians retreat from the salient south of Kremennoye, likely to prevent the possible encirclement. It was 3 kilometers in narrowest point, so getting in and out of positions there was extremely dangerous, under drone-controlled skies. With hindsight, it's important to mention that once any corridor becomes too narrow, the FPV drones are capable of literally patrolling it 24/7, completely cutting out any logistics. This in turn makes holding positions impossible, and essentially is a modern way to isolate parts of the battlefield without having a single soldier behind enemy lines. Ukraine, meanwhile, also conducts its first strike with Storm Shadow missiles, as well as regular HIMARS GMLRS rockets on the Russian command post. It was hidden in the bunker near the village of Mar'yino, so the use of Storm Shadows, which also have bunker-busting properties, was extremely relevant. In this strike, directed by drones of the 78th Air Assault Regiment and 413th UAV Battalion, 18 officers are killed, and 33 are wounded, including 3 North Koreans, and likely Lieutenant General Valery Solochuk, deputy commander of the Leningrad military district. This is the first, but not last, attack which aims to cripple Russian chains of command to disrupt the continuing brutal assaults in Kursk region. On November 25th, Ukrainians also destroy 92 N6E radar station and 2 launchers of the Russian state-of-art S-400 air defense missile system with 3 ATACMS missiles in the area of Bolshoye Zhirovo, not far from Kursk. Among killed are 2 crew members and 3 engineers that were servicing the system. On land, Russians somewhat intensify attacks on Ukrainian positions, on November 26th driving a large column of the 104th Guards Air Assault Regiment through Zelený Shlях. As usual, assault is poorly planned, because the head of the column is composed of thinly armed aluminum BMDs loaded with huge amount of ammunition and paratroopers. After hitting landmines on the road, these explode one after the other, without the slightest chance for troops inside. The T-72 that followed BMDs apparently hits a landmine and falls off the road, just to be soon finished by a FPV drone. The same fate awaits another tank of the same type, which for some reason was at the very end of the column. One of the BMDs, after seeing literal evaporation of 3 other vehicles in front, apparently decides to retreat turning around and driving quite far away. But it hits a landmine too, likely also dropped from the drone and finished off by the FPV after being abandoned. Apparently, it was not loaded with too much ammo, which saved crew's lives, who yet were later killed by drone-dropped grenades. This assault also features two quite rare Russian Buran infantry mobility vehicles. Surprisingly, these proved much safer than BMDs, likely saving the crew's lives instead of incinerating them after both struck landmines. This once again highlights the advantage of MRAPs over traditional vehicles. Their combination of speed, light but still effective armor, and the absence of easily flammable munitions inside gives crews far greater chances of surviving drone strikes compared to traditional IFVs or APCs, especially Soviet models. As we have already seen, it's Ukraine, not Russia, that primarily operates MRAPs, and this advantage continues to save countless lives. Exactly MRAPs, which are also far easier to replace than the tanks or IFVs, make up the largest share of Ukraine's relatively high vehicle losses. While Russians continue their regular mechanized assaults with vehicle columns on the western flank of the salient, they also begin similar daily attacks against Ukrainian positions around Plekhovo. Here, 129th DDF Brigade and its drone company Ravens, which are not as famous as the 47th Mechanized or 95th Air Assault Brigades, does an excellent job in repelling attacks. The fields to the east of Plekhovo are littered with remains of 18 BTR-82s that were destroyed from November 12th to 30th. This forces Russians to switch to more common and costly tactic of small infantry groups, which have to walk towards positions through open fields under constant drone strikes. Throughout November, numerous reports surfaced about first engagements involving North Korean soldiers. If these accounts are accurate, it suggests that Russian forces were attempting to quietly integrate them into existing units, reportedly those from Buryatia and other eastern regions of Russia, where their presence could be more easily obscured. However, as the Kremlin grows increasingly desperate to drive Ukrainian forces out of the Kursk region, before the new year, efforts at concealment appear to be abandoned. In a significant escalation, 12,000 allegedly Kim Jong-un's most capable troops have now been deployed to Kursk in full force, no longer hidden and ready to confront Ukrainian troops head-on, and we will discuss this deployment in the next part of our series.